If you don't know me, I'm Catherine Pemberton. I'm the director of the Powder Magazine Museum in Charleston, and we're putting on this Zoom series in the month of May about Pirates of the Carolinas. So we had a great lecture last week. We've got Ben this week. We'll have Karen Bloom next week, and then we'll round it out with Dr. Linda Carnes McNaughton, who's going to talk about Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge excavation. Karen next week's going to talk about the women pirates. But tonight, Dr. Ben is going to talk to us about the pirate hunters of the Carolina coast. Ben holds a PhD in Atlantic World and Maritime History, which is perfect for us. That degree is from the University of New Hampshire. He's also a graduate of the College of Charleston, where he teaches now as an adjunct professor in the history department. His book, Self-Defense and Sea Power, The Provincial Navies of the British Atlantic World, 1630 to 1776, is under review by the University of Alabama Press. Ben, did you just get some good news on that or something?
Still being reviewed. It's got some positive reviews. It's a long process, so we'll fingers crossed.
Yes, definitely. So we're getting a little preview of some of that tonight. When he's not teaching and working, he is also doing living history with the crew that hopefully you'll come by the Powder Magazine on Saturday from 10 to 4 during regular hours, and with regular museum admission. We're hosting the crew of the Charles Revenge, which is a group of living history folks that you can kind of see on the screen there. And they're going to be taking over the Powder Magazine for the day. So come by, bring the family. I think it'll be a really, really fun event. So with that, I'll let Ben go. We'll hope to have some time at the end for questions. Do try and keep yourself muted if you can. That way we just don't get any barking dogs or anything like that. But if you do have a question at the end, you can always put it in the chat, and I'll read it out, and we can engage in some conversation at the end as well. All right, Ben, take it away.
Well, folks, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for everyone who's come, whether in the tour guide community or friends of mine. I'm also a tour guide, so I know what it's like to have to go to lectures to get credit, but I hope you enjoy today. So my focus today will be on the pirate hunters of the South Carolina coast, and just to be a little anachronistic, I used 18th century style spelling for the title of my lecture, but regrettably, a 21st century problem emerged. The 18th century font I used didn't register through Zoom. So pretty close to what something of that era looks like. Pirate hunting is the other side of the law that doesn't often get talked about when we consider the pop culture view of pirates. One of the most famous pirate hunters from Charlestown's history, William Rhett, is buried just around the corner from the Powder Magazine. So if you do come to our Living History program on Saturday, or Karen's Living History program, I believe on May 20th, and or any of the other events, yes, please do go see our deceased pirate hunter friend, William Rhett, who's buried at St. Philip's churchyard by the British flag. So I just wanted to make mention of that to be kind of topical before we get started with today's lecture. So the main point, and I hate to be didactic, but every time I give a lecture to my college students, I always try to have a main point, is that South Carolina's experience with pirate hunting in the colonial era was an imperfect solution that was created for a problem that we essentially made for ourselves. It was a homegrown solution for a homegrown problem. So much of our pirate problems emerge out of Charleston's affinity and sort of corrupt alliance with pirates. And it definitely gets to be Pandora's box that Pandora herself is going to have to try to get back in the box as much as possible. And throughout this lecture, I will use various paintings. This one's by Howard Pyle, who's sort of known for his romantic views of the golden age of piracy. Although I grew up with his paintings, and I know they're not always accurate, but I like to think that they capture the spirit of pirate hunting and piracy itself. So I would like you to imagine for a second a well-armed ship off the coast. She's well-armed, has a full complement of 19 officers, 231 seamen aboard, and she knows pirate ships are nearby. They've been an issue in the area for a long time, and she has every intent of bringing them to justice. Now, if I asked you to tell me what era you think this description is, you might be tempted to say the 18th century. Perhaps your mind would go to a Royal Navy captain patrolling the waters off of Charleston, looking for Blackbeard or pirates of that sort. What if I told you I was describing none other than the USS Herschel Woody Williams, a modern day anti-piracy ship, rather. It's not a pirate ship, it's part of the US Navy, that is currently, as we speak, active as part of the United States Africa Command's forces looking for pirates off the west coast of Africa. The US and other NATO allies have been active in hunting pirates for some time off the Gulf of Aden, in West Africa, and famously about 10 years ago off of Somalia. I had hoped to pull up a live piracy map at this moment to show you where some of the modern pirate issues have emerged, but because I'm a little inept when it comes to Zoom, I will do that at the very end of the lecture, kind of rounding us out. But this is a historical lecture, but piracy and pirate hunting are going on at this very moment. So this is as much current as it is historical. Now, pirates, you would assume that we all have a straight definition of what these terms are. I always like to be a little sure that we're all talking on the same page when it comes to pirates, pirate hunters, a privateer. So some various terms I will use today include pirates, which at their very basis are maritime raiders without government approval. If you want a simple definition, this is the best one to go by. If you want a little more specific modern definition, the UN Law of the Sea defines piracy as, quote, any illegal acts of violence or detention or any acts of depredation committed for private ends by the crew of passengers of a private ship or aircraft and directed on the high seas against another ship or aircraft, or against persons or property on board such ship or aircraft, and it goes on and on. That's actually the opening to the definition. So it gets a little wordy, and for modern lawyers, that can be an issue. But for our purposes, we'll call pirates maritime raiders without government approval. That differs them from privateers, who are, their main difference from pirates is a sheet of paper. It's called a letter of marque. It allows for a maritime raider to have government approval to raid usually enemy ships in a time of war. Now, the most common vessel of both pirates and pirate hunters is a sloop. And I realize that my rather large head is obscuring the sloop. So I'm actually going to move out of the way for a second so you can see. That is a sloop called the Luna. The Luna is a reconstructed tall ship that was just built by friends of mine in coastal Virginia, and it's built in the manner of a Bermuda sloop from the 18th century. So it's very similar to what both pirates and our pirate hunters will discuss used. Now, the most well-known pirate hunters, and to be fair, some of the world's oldest and continuous pirate hunters, are the British Royal Navy. These are state-sponsored vessels directly paid for by the British Crown. Charlestown and Carolina, by extension, was a privately owned colony. That means we were not owned by the Crown. We were, as some of you may know, a proprietary colony owned by a group of wealthy landlords who were bribed by Charles II with a bunch of land that they didn't own to ensure their loyalty. And of course, their descendants will hold the titles till the 1720s. They were businessmen. They were not crown-appointed governors. They didn't necessarily hold much interest in the defense of Charlestown. So a lot of the colonies that had Royal Navy ships were those colonies that had royal governors that were directly governed by the Crown. The closest one to here, for instance, would be Virginia. Virginia, after 1620 or so, is a royal colony with a royal warship and occasional British troops. South Carolina was sort of a backwater, if you want to think of it like a Wild West area. It was not a colony that was the forefront of the Crown's military ambitions, which leaves the locals to have to build their own navies. And a lot of my own personal research has been on the phenomenon of what's known as provincial navies. Provincial navies are local fleets. We have evidence that almost every Anglo-American colony from Nova Scotia down to Barbados at some point or another in the 17th and 18th centuries used local funds or force to create their own independent sort of naval militias. And eventually that experience will be very important when Americans will build their own navies during the Revolutionary War. But that's in the future. We are now in the late 16 and in the early 1700s. So any understanding of pirate hunting in colonial South Carolina has to come with the understanding that we really could only blame ourselves for our pirate issues. Now, pirate hunting will be a product of a cultural shift in which locals decide piracy is a threat to their existence. But for the first, 20 or 30 years of Charlestown's existence, pirates were not considered an existential threat to Charleston. They were considered vital to the lifeblood of the city. I don't want to step too much on the toes of my friend Eric Lavender, who spoke to a large extent very well on this last week. But just to reiterate a couple things that, in case you missed it, and locals in Charleston, at least starting in the 1680s, had regular meetings and collaboration with pirates. Violent tensions with Native Americans and Spanish officials in St. Augustine made local officials in Charlestown, a backwater English port city, hopeful that privately hired naval forces, whether they were pirates or not, could provide some level of coastal security. Pirates were a boon to the local economy for sex workers at the places like the Pink House, for tavern owners, for politicians, for plantation owners. We do have records that plantation owners like John Boone of Boone Hall fame, or Robert Seabrook of Seabrook Island fame, men who were very wealthy planters whose names are still in the landscape of Charleston today, were not only engaged with pirates, but in some cases either did business deals with them or perhaps got enslaved Africans from them, or hard currency. Hard currency we take for granted today. For those of you that still carry it around, that is, coins and dollar bills in your pocket. They were at a premium in the late 1600s, and pirates not only brought in enslaved Africans and business to the colony, but also brought in physical hard currency, gold doubloons, for instance, that had been stolen from the Spanish. And that does serve as a boon to the local economy. Now, we had an understanding with that as long as you scratch our back, we'll scratch you. The 1690s, 690. Are you able to hear me, Catherine? Are you guys able to hear me?
No, it's him. Not
No,
us.
did it go? One second.
I think it's coming in and out a little bit, but I think maybe you're back. Do you want to?
Can you hear me now?
That sounds good.
Yeah, sorry. Where did it cut off at?
I think
Hard currency.
Hard currency. Oh, okay. All right. Well, these are 21st century problems, folks. So I hope that I haven't cut up too much. But yeah, hard currency, enslaved Africans, and other boons to the local economy were provided by pirates. So there was an arrangement where if pirates didn't attack Charlestown, Charleston authorities wouldn't crack down on them. One of my favorite stories comes from the 1690s. A group of former privateers, remember those government authorized maritime raiders, were supposed to be fighting the French, but they turned around and they then attacked a Muslim treasure fleet in the Red Sea. Now, the crew of this particular ship comes to Charlestown, and they're allowed to vote in a local election, provided they provide some money. So there's definitely not a lot of moral qualms with not only pirates, but what they're doing, so long as locals are not the ones being targeted. Now, increasingly, South Carolina's affinity for piracy was not only a threat to our Spanish neighbors in St. Augustine, who, of course, were the main victims of this trade, in quotes, but many people in London, particularly the Lords Proprietors themselves, and King Charles, King James, and later King William, Queen Anne, and King George I will all be very upset with the local affinity for piracy. It challenges not only security for the British Empire, but also the very fact that Americans in Charleston are making an independent living, not necessarily requiring any connection to their imperial overlords in London. It does provide some level of independence, and that is a scary prospect even 100 years before the American Revolution. So it's sort of an interesting foreshadowing of things to come in the future. So authorities in London are not happy about this situation. Charleston is certainly not alone in being a pirate haven. Newport, Rhode Island, got the nickname for Rhode Island, Rogue Island. So it is no surprise there that Rhode Island is a proprietary colony as well. Also, famously, Jamaica had at one point been a pirate nest for famous buccaneers like Henry Morgan. So this is an empire-wide problem, and South Carolina is simply a symptom rather than the main sickness. Now, there are important changes that occur. Now, can everyone still hear me? Are we still? Okay, good. Thank you, Braxton. I apologize about my internet connection. Now, there were changes that occur in the late 17th and the early 18th centuries that allow for locals to get a worse taste in their mouth for piracy. It does take some empire-wide changes to make this happen. Parliament was one of the main game changers when it came down to cracking on tempestuous ports like Charlestown. Particularly after famous English privateers like Captain Kidd and Henry Every turn against the very people who hired them, who have become pirates when they were supposed to be privateers against the French. So King William, Parliament, and other very major British government officials start to crack down on the colony's affinity for piracy. It got so bad that in Charleston, there were pirates voting in elections. And in Virginia, the College of William and Mary's first ever endowment came from pirates. So once again, we are not alone in this collusion with pirates, but it is certainly something that's not endearing Charlestown to authorities in London. So changes in the air as the 1600s come to an end and as the new 18th century emerges. So one of the big change makers you might recognize the name of, who comes to Charlestown, is a man by the name of Nicholas Trott. Nicholas Trott was a local judge who I believe tour guides have nicknamed the hanging judge because of his tendency to execute pirates. But as a younger man in 1698, 1699, when he will come to Charleston, he brings with him a very important administrative experience working in English law. He's one of the first American lawyers that has European legal training, and that is a resource the colony will benefit by. There are a lot of jurisdictional issues in Charlestown about who controls the port. The Crown wants to crack down on cities like Charleston who are so pro-pirate. They do this by creating what are known as courts of vice admiralty. These courts are courts that will adjudicate prizes and try pirates outside of what local juries and jurisdictions can manage. So I won't dive too far into the weeds of the legal machinations going on in the 16 and early 1700s. Just know that going pirate hunting is not a straightforward proposition. There are a lot of politicians who, just like today, when there's a criminal investigation, you get the FBI, the CIA, the DEA. These agencies all have their desire to be the main investigator. This is not a new problem. We see this happening in colonial Charleston and throughout the British Empire as well. The Crown would like to take the lead with pirate hunting. Locals would like to. It's an interesting dilemma, but I will defer to scholars such as Mark Hanna, who've written extensively on this, rather than going into it here, because this is a lecture on pirate hunters, not so much pirate trials. So what changes Charleston's attitude to pirates is not just one man like Nicholas Trott bringing more knowledge of English law to the colony, but also the economy starts to change by the early 1700s. One major thing that many of you already likely know, if you're a local, but if you're not, by the early 1700s, the beginning of the cash crop system starts to emerge in South Carolina. Enslaved Africans start to produce rice seeds in the first couple of decades of the 18th century. And by the end of the first quarter of the 18th century, Carolina gold, as it's known, will make South Carolina, which is at one point was a backwater colony, one of the most wealthy, or up and coming at least, ports in the British Empire. These plantation owners like Robert Seabrook or John Boone, whose plantation you can still visit today, start to notice that more money can be made through enslavement of Africans and rice cultivation than necessarily just working with pirates. That doesn't mean they suddenly turn on pirates, but there is certainly a cultural shift. There's more immigration to the city, more French Huguenots, more people of all backgrounds, and the city's getting larger. Its connections to the British Empire are increasing. And also, we're at war. War tends to distract people from smaller local issues. In 1702, Charleston joins the rest of the British Empire in a huge war called the Queen Anne's War. Now, the Queen Anne's War will be an empire-wide war pitting the British and the Dutch against the French and Spanish. This seems to be the case for most wars in the 18th century. It's sort of a rinse and repeat, whether it's fights over who gets to take over after a dynasty or who gets to take over X, Y, or AB colony. That doesn't matter so much as the fact that Charlestown is now part of a world war. When you hear the term World War, your brain probably goes to Verdun and World War I. You don't usually think of Charlestown or Charleston in the early 1700s, but Charleston was very much a part of Queen Anne's War, an international conflict, as much as anywhere else in the British Empire. And locals commission privateers, which once again are those privately hired forces that the governor can sign a letter of marque for, giving them the right to raid enemy shipping. Locals also build provincial navies. In many different cases, Charlestown is engaged in major fighting with the French and Spanish. Famously, Governor James Moore leads a force of several hundred sailors that he had impressed, as the term goes. Impressment means forcing or drafting of a sailor. He had led sailors to try to attack St. Augustine, Florida. One of the key facts of St. Augustine, Florida, if you go visit that lovely city today, has anyone been there? Show of hands. Okay, good number of you. If you go there, outside of the Castillo de San Marcos, the main fortress in town, there are no buildings older than 1702. You can thank Charlestonians for that. There was a major attack on St. Augustine. It does fail because the Spaniards put up a very heroic fight in that Castillo. But this was done with no Royal Navy forces, just local militia and provincial Navy forces. In 1706, Franco-Spanish forces invade Charlestown. They try to capture the city. Colonel William Rhett, who is pictured to from my perspective, he's on my left, but he might be on your right. He's the guy who looks like Jodie Foster with a big wig on, so not me. Colonel William Rhett is able to force several local merchant ships in the harbor, of which there were always many, into this sort of temporary emergency flotilla. And they chased the French and Spanish in August of 1706 out of Charlestown without having to fire a shot. It was a bit farcical. So throughout the Queen Anne's War, Charleston's able to successfully defend itself, even if it fails at taking over Spanish territory, with nothing but local resources, local naval forces put together. This will become vital when it comes to pirate hunting. The knowledge that we can build our own pirate hunting fleets at home without necessarily having to depend on His Majesty George I or before him Queen Anne. So this is an important lesson for us to learn. But then crisis emerges. When the Queen Anne's War ends in 1713, there are a number of problems. First off, there were 36,000 unemployed British sailors throughout the British Atlantic world, men who had made their money privateering, being pirates for hire. And now all of a sudden, Queen Anne and King Louis XIV have decided the war is over. But for these men, many of them are not willing to accept that, and they keep fighting. One of the most famous of those men, who was a former privateer who became a pirate, is pictured right above me. Does anybody know his name up there? Just curious. Yeah, Blackbeard. Edward Thatch. We'll come back to him in a second. But the end of the fighting in South Carolina does not mean the end of military difficulties. To the south of Charlestown, a native people known as the Yamasee were furious, rightfully so, at the abuses of Indian traders from the colony of South Carolina. They had faced enslavement and oppression from white authorities in Charleston, so they rebel. And they lead an Indian war that's considered one of the bloodiest Native American attacks in colonial history. That puts it on par with New England's King Philip's War. Indigenous warriors killed upwards of 7% of the colony's population. And that very nearly destroyed Charlestown, forcing many settlers to flee within the walls of the city. Not far from where I live, near Hollywood, South Carolina, are the burnt ruins of St. Paul's Anglican Church, which are ruined from this attack during the Yamasee War. Much of the fighting in this war happens not on land, but on sea. When one thinks of Indian wars, they often think of fights on land. I mean, one of the most classic battles that comes to mind when discussing Indian wars is Little Bighorn, in the middle of the far west, nowhere near the sea. But in early America, much of the fighting between native peoples and European colonizers happened on boats, happened on ships. Around Beaufort, Parris Island, Edisto, Johns Island, crews of South Carolina's naval militia, known as the Scout Boat Navy, fought with native peoples on canoes, almost like a little naval war. This war does end with an English victory, but like I said, it nearly wiped out the colony. It forced South Carolina to beg the royal government and even local governments in the American South, like Virginia, for help. We nearly got wiped out, and there definitely was a moment where locals did not think Charlestown would survive the winter of 1716, 1717. Even though the main onslaught of the indigenous attacks does get pushed back, but only just barely, and not even just with European help, but with the help of allied native peoples like the Cherokee. So locals, such as Governor Robert Johnson, reach out to the Lords Proprietors in London, reach out to the Crown. They ask for Royal Navy support. They ask for British soldiers, and they really get a deaf ear. There is a bit of a moment where locals feel that they're not being heard, whether that's intentional or the fact that England has a lot going on, like Jacobite rebellions, dealing with the ramifications of the global war is hard to say. But locals felt that they were completely and totally alone. And that was no more apparent than in May of 1718, when Blackbeard, the man pictured above me with that impressive set of facial hair, blockades Charlestown Harbor. Now, why he blockades the harbor is a matter of speculation. Some say for certain illnesses of an adult nature. Others say because he wanted money. It's hard to say, but his demands were a chest of medicine. He was able to blockade a completely and totally fortified walled city. You may recall from the last slide that Charlestown, and I'll go back for a second, we were completely walled in. I mean, the city by 1718 was a fortress, and Blackbeard with his major ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, whom one of our later speakers, Dr. McNaughton, will discuss, was on par with a Royal Navy warship. You can sort of see it pictured here in the background. He demands a chest of medicine. He's able to put a stranglehold on the colony for a week, and there are no local forces. There are no British ships that can fight him. Locals are no more aware than just now with this happening, how powerless they are. Pirates in the aftermath of Queen Anne's War have gotten so powerful that they're not just coming to Charleston to collude with locals like they had in previous iterations. They are now fully set on attacking their own people, attacking the English, even though they are English pirates. I think Blackbeard is a wake-up call for locals who assumed that just because a pirate is English means that he'll like us. We saw the crows coming home to roost, so to speak. Blackbeard, a product in some ways of the same system we had invested so heavily in, is now attacking us. So I think locals definitely have a moment of reckoning when this happens. So locals decide to take the offensive against pirates, even though they are cash-strapped. To use an original quote from Governor Robert Johnson, he said, when he got reports of a pirate named Charles Vane off the coast, who was a friend of Blackbeard's, he, for want of men and money, still got ready 2 ships to go hunting for the pirate. Now, these 2 ships were 2 sloops. They were merchant vessels, similar to the one depicted in the picture right here in the middle of this slide. Sloops were typically single-masted vessels. I've heard them referred to as the 18-wheelers of the Atlantic world, and this is very true. They were cargo ships primarily. They do carry some weapons on board, perhaps some small cannon, and the sailors typically were not dressed in the Hollywood pirate sense that you might imagine. If you look at this picture on the slide of a sailor, you see him in what's known as a sailor's jacket or a sleeved waistcoat. He's dressed in the manner of the Royal Navy during this time period. He's not wearing a big, bulky, tri-cornered hat. He doesn't have an eye patch or a hook or a peg leg. He's dressed in a manner not terribly different from civilians on land. A few key factors that are still present in naval uniforms today. You probably already noticed them. First off, the neckerchief, that big white thing around his neck. You see, neckerchiefs help keep the grease from your hair out of your clothing, and also protect your neck from sunburn. The gray and red he's wearing, once again, this is not a uniform per se. This is elements common to the Royal Navy at the time, not far off from any sailor in the Atlantic world. Most of the sailors on these merchant ships that the government of South Carolina will impress or force are poor, lower echelons of society, perhaps illiterate. Most of these sailors are not from Charlestown. Very few people from Charlestown own ships. So all the ships in the harbor are from England, New York, Philadelphia, other ports throughout the British Empire. Many of these men are probably in their 20s or 30s at most. I'm almost 30 years old, so I'm pushing the limit on probably the age of who would have been on these vessels. They are mostly Anglo-American or British, though certainly there are people of color, Native Americans, enslaved and free Africans as well. But these people were forced against their will, in some cases, to fight in these provincial navies. What happens in Charleston, apparently, is Colonel William Rhett is commissioned by Governor Robert Johnson to put together sort of this anti-pirate fleet out of merchant ships. And it seems from the records the men were willing to fight, but he had the power to, quote, impress them or to force them should they refuse. So the expedition sails to the Cape Fear River of North Carolina, about 130 men, led by Colonel William Rhett. And as some of you probably already know, they don't find the pirate Charles Vane, they find the pirate Stede Bonnet. Stede Bonnet is many things, but a good pirate is probably not one of them. There's a reason history has known him as the gentleman pirate. He came from a plantation in Barbados. He buys his own ship, whereas most pirates steal their vessels. He certainly had no naval experience. In fact, he was so much of a thorn in the side of Edward Teach, Blackbeard, that Blackbeard literally ghosted him and abandoned him off the coast of North Carolina. By the time Colonel William Rhett and his flotilla captures Stede Bonnet in battle, it's a fierce fight. Both sides get caught on sandbars off the Cape Fear River. They both get in a huge melee, or excuse me, a huge gun battle, not a melee. And eventually, 18 English sailors and perhaps as many pirates are killed in this battle. For the side of the Provincial Navy, that's a 14%, approximately 14% casualty rate. That is a high casualty rate for men who may not have had a choice but to fight for the colony of South Carolina. You can see pictured just behind me another Howard Pyle art piece of Colonel William Rhett interviewing Stede Bonnet upon capturing him. And you can kind of see some of the damage and the wounds on board the vessel. So William Rhett brings Stede Bonnet back to Charlestown, has him thrown on house arrest. For those who don't know this, it's a bit farcical. There's a botched escape attempt. He's eventually recaptured, brought back to the city, put on trial, and of course he was hanged publicly at White Point Gardens. Now, here's the interesting thing. When the Provincial Navy attacks Stede Bonnet, they rescue two different merchant ships that he had recently pirated from. The South Carolina government demands that these merchant captains pay for their rescue. Let me say that again. There were two merchant ships that were rescued from Stede Bonnet, and South Carolina's government demanded they pay quote unquote salvage fees. Needless to say, these merchant captains didn't have a dollar to their name, so they defaulted. They said, we can't do it. So what does the South Carolina government do? It seizes their ships from them, essentially doing the very same thing that Stede Bonnet had done to them to begin with. So I hope that I'm not painting the pirate hunters as the forces of light versus the forces of darkness and evil. History is never that black and white. But there is certainly something to be said for the fact that the pirate hunters themselves will seize ships from victims of pirates to pay off the pirate hunters. One other tragic element of this capture, there was an enslaved man who was escaping from his masters in South Carolina. His name was Ned Grant, may have been named Edward Grant. He was fleeing. He was first captured by Stede Bonnet. Then he was captured by the pirate hunters, and then he was auctioned off by the pirate hunters to make money for the men who went hunting for Stede Bonnet. So pirate hunters in South Carolina certainly secured the coast, but they also deprived enslaved Africans of their freedom and deprived merchant captains of their own vessels if they couldn't afford to pay for their rescue. So really, it is a matter of pick your poison. Would you rather be a victim of pirates or the state? There's not a lot of in between in this very hectic situation. But from the perspective of the South Carolina government, this was a very successful mission. Unfortunately, they weren't done with pirates just yet. Immediately, there were problems with another pirate captain just off the coast. His name was Richard Worley. He was either from Pennsylvania or New York. We know this because he had previously sailed a ship called the New York's Revenge. When he lost that vessel, he got a new vessel and named it the New York Revenge's Revenge. The New York Revenge's Revenge, which at least shows he had a sense of humor. So we do see a little Jack Sparrow in this individual. Now, Governor Johnson himself personally leads a force of merchant vessels to attack Worley in the middle of Charleston Harbor. This is not a battle off the coast of Cape Fear, North Carolina. This is a battle within Charlestown's harbor itself. And local merchant vessels combined with our scout boat navy, a fleet of patrol vessels that had been operational since Queen Anne's War, and which is pictured in this drawing by Larry Ivers, which you can see on the slide. These were deployed against the pirate Worley. They were successfully able to defeat him in a battle that probably was able to be viewed from the battery. The same place that you go to watch your 4th of July shows over the harbor, if you're a Charlestonian, is where locals were watching the battle between the Provincial Navy of South Carolina and the pirate Worley. Worley is captured in battle. I actually believe he's killed in battle. I could be wrong on that, but he does either get killed in battle or executed. I have to double check on that. His men are certainly executed alongside Stede Bonnet's men, and their bodies are left on public display on the battery, which back then was known as Oyster Point or White Point. Now, this is another successful case of locals using local resources to go pirate hunting. But you could be forgiven for thinking this is a silver bullet. This just stops pirates. It doesn't. It fights a symptom of piracy. But what's the problem with building local navies or forcing local merchant ships into service against their will? You get a lot of ticked off sailors. You get a lot of financial difficulties, especially if your colony, like South Carolina, was still recovering from Indian wars, recovering from the Queen Anne's War, and dealing with epidemics such as yellow fever. Locals were very upset at the delays of assistance from the lords proprietors in particular, those same men who were technically distant landlords who owned South Carolina. So they did what South Carolinians have long done throughout their history. They rebelled. I forget the exact list of rebellions in South Carolina history, but the first is oftentimes thought to be the proprietor or the rebellion against the proprietors of 1719. There were other issues at play, but one of the major issues that leads local politicians to rebel against the lords proprietors is their inattentiveness when it comes to piracy and providing weapons and military support. Locals work with King George I, not his grandson, who will also rebel against, King George I, to get a royal government in South Carolina. South Carolina, by the late 1720s, although effectively a little earlier, will be a royal colony. As I said at the beginning of this lecture, what does a royal colony bring with it? Royal military forces. It brings with it also a closer connection to London and a greater aversion to piracy. This was an important change in the Constitution of colonial South Carolina. By 1720, a sixth-rate Royal Navy vessel, which is similar to the one portrayed in the picture on this slide, the Flamborough, led by Captain John Hildesley, will be a station ship in Charlestown. Now, I went to London several times. Thankfully, I didn't have to pay for it. I got some very generous grants from my university and from donors to be able to go to the National Archives in London and do some research on the Royal Navy and on provincial navies. And I went through Royal Navy ship logs, like the one just above me here. This is the ship log of the Flamborough. And I went there as a bright-eyed young grad student a few years ago, thinking that I would read accounts of battles with pirates and hangings. And what I found in the Flamborough ship log was gale, northwest, tide changed, southwest, docked at Sullivan's Island, searched a merchant ship. That was the most exciting thing Hildesley did. As far as I could tell, he never went pirate hunting. The presence of a Royal Navy ship in South Carolina from 1720 until the American Revolution, of course, not the same ship, several Royal Navy vessels, will be an effective deterrent for pirates. Many of our streets are named after Royal Navy pirate hunters, and Dr. Nick Butler has done excellent research and podcasts on the Royal Navy station captains of South Carolina, so I definitely will defer to him on that. But just to reiterate a point he made, Anson Street, Vernon Street, these are streets in downtown Charleston you may have seen before if you're a local, that are named for our affection for our Royal Navy protectors. Was it a compatible buddy-buddy relationship? No. The fact that the Revolutionary War happens 50 years later was in no small part due to local anger at royal overreach and tensions with British military forces. But this certainly does provide some security against pirates. Locals will have pirates bothering us and enemy privateers and guardacostas, or Spanish coast guards, which locals consider pirates to be a threat for the rest of the 18th century. So this is not a done deal in 1720, but certainly we see the end of what would be known as the golden age of piracy through no small effort of locals and royal officials. So how do we remember these men today in Charleston? Well, we don't, which is part of what I'm hoping to reverse with this lecture. First off, the picture on the right is a very cute children-oriented pirate cruise. So you can go pirate hunting in Charleston now. I think it's called the Pirates of Charleston Cruise. You can take your children, and it looks like a lot of fun. I'd be lying if I said my 30-year-old self didn't want to go do it. You get to fight a pirate with water cannons. So I suppose if that's your cup of tea, I highly recommend it. When looking up Charleston pirate hunting in Google Images, I came across this, so it did give me a good laugh. I believe it's in John's Island. But more seriously, how do we historically remember the sacrifices of the men who went pirate hunting? The answer is we don't. You've probably all been to the Battery and seen this monument. Near this spot in the autumn of 1718, Stede Bonnet, notorious gentleman pirate, and 29 of his men, captured by Colonel William Rhett, met their just deserts. This is an example from the 1940s of what historians call great man history. The idea that you could say George Washington crossed the Delaware and ignore the fact that he had 3,000 or 4,000 poorly treated soldiers alongside him. In the last couple decades, there have been attempts to try to bring voices back to marginalized peoples, including sailors. And I think that when we talk about the history of pirate hunting, we have to be careful when we say Colonel William Rhett went pirate hunting. A rich plantation-owning Charleston colonel he was, but a single-handed superhero with a cape he was not. He could not have fought Stede Bonnet without those 130 sailors from all over the British Empire and probably from Africa and among Native American tribes, if we consider they may have been a diverse crew. Without these men, he wouldn't have been able to capture Stede Bonnet. Without these men, Governor Johnson could not have caught Captain Worley. So I don't mean to say these are the earliest U.S. Navy sailors in Charleston, but these are certainly men who fought and died for the colony that don't get any press coverage whatsoever. And when the era is referred to, they're completely ignored, just so we can mention William Rhett and Stede Bonnet. So if anything, I hope this lecture does remind people that it is the everyday sailors that help turn the wheel of pirate hunting. Just like today, the military is built upon the individual as much as it is the collective. So I hope that this lecture has entertained you and brought some attention to a very little discussed topic and the men who were part of it. And I do want to include a list of sources. I'm going to hide here for a second, because even though I do my own research, I have a lot of both secondary and primary sources that inspired not only this lecture, but my own work. So I know this is being recorded. If anyone would like to take a screenshot of this slide so you can see some of the sources I used, including Nick Butler's Charleston Time Machine podcast, Chris Downey's Charleston and the Golden Age of Piracy, Mark Hanna's Protecting the Rights of Englishmen, an article that you can get on JSTOR, Larry Ivers' This Torrent of Indians, which is an excellent book on the Yemasee War. You can get that on Kindle. And Carl Swanson's article, The Unspeakable Calamity, which you can get for free. It's actually via the Northern Mariner Journal online. If anyone would like, I can also send you a copy of these or put them in the chat if that would be more effective for you. So I don't have to leave the slide up for an eternity, but I like to point to other scholars who've also covered this topic and certainly inspired my own work. But this is the end of my lecture. This has been a real pleasure to be able to speak with each and every one of you. And I believe Catherine Catherine might have some questions for me. Yes, I can put them in the chat. Let me see if I can actually pull that up real quick.
While Ben's doing that, I guess we'll wait to see if we've got some questions. Just to reinforce what Ben was saying about the great man, the history and everything. One of the things that I always think about with Colonel William Rhett, the connection with the pirates and the powder magazine itself, is, in a lot of histories, it's Colonel William Rhett built the powder magazine, and that's, not true. He wasn't forming bricks and laying them. Certainly he had some oversight, but again, Nick Butler's done really great research into a lot of the fortification efforts, and some of the non-elite people who are working on the fortifications and the powder magazine just sort of get left out of the sort of mainstream history. So I think it's really important for us to do that. So Ben's put those up that you can kind of see. We've got thank yous and great jobs. And I can't see.
I think there's a question from Paul.
Paul says, I've heard that Stede Bonnet blockaded Charleston Harbor in exchange for mercury. And I've also heard that it was Stede Bonnet.
Oh, sorry. So
I think he was saying maybe Black. So I guess maybe he was thinking he's heard it was Blackbeard or Stede Bonnet. So
Yeah, Blackbeard blockades Charleston Harbor. He was certainly looking for medicine. One of the medicines he was looking for was known as quicksilver, which, since I believe this is a G-rated chat, I can't really explain what he was looking for it for. But if you're adults, you could probably do some Googling. There's a great website called Pirate Surgeon, done by a friend of mine, that goes into the details of how healthcare on a pirate ship worked. And actually, at the Living History on Saturday, I'll have a recreated medical chest. So for those who are interested in that, I hate to do a shameless plug, but
Please.
certainly mercury was one of the things he wanted. Pirates were notorious for illnesses from taverns, so to speak. But he also wanted, quinine, I'm sure, for malaria, other things that were common in the period.
Right. Okay, we've got a new one.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
So I heard that Nicholas Trott, I can't remember if this is, I just want you to verify if you know this. Nicholas Trott, namesake, his uncle was a judge in Barbados who ruined his reputation because of pirates and taking grift. That's why our Nicholas Trott was so brutal towards him. Is that correct?
That's absolutely 100% true. Yeah, Nicholas Trott Sr. and this, I had to stop bringing this up in my classes because my poor freshmen would get so confused, and it's not their fault because it is confusing. But Nicholas Trott Sr. Was the governor of the Bahamas, and he took a bribe from Henry Avery and colluded with him and allowed him to escape justice. So Nicholas Trott Jr., who was a trained lawyer, I think was sort of a bit discouraged by the family legacy and was driven in no small part by that.
Just to answer the question from Adam about what time is the Living History, I think the crew's going to be there from 10 to 4. Is that right, Ben? Or
10 to 4, that's right.
Thereabouts. Regular opening hours at the Powder Magazine on Saturday. And again, you just pay regular museum admission, and it's going to be all about pirates. So I think a lot of people will be probably out front in the cannon yard with the pirates. So you can come and hang out. And like I said, I think it's going to be a lot of fun for the family. So it'll be a great thing. Paul was asking too if there was a particular crime that Stede Bonnet committed that caused Rhett to go after him.
Yeah, so actually Rhett wasn't necessarily going after Stede Bonnet. He was going after Charles Vane, who was another associate of Blackbeard's, and he came across Bonnet, kind of caught him in the act. He was in possession of some merchant ships he had captured. And it's kind of funny, in the trial of Stede Bonnet, which you can find online, his men claimed, we thought you were pirates, so that's why we fired on you when William Rhett sailed in. So sort of pleading the fifth and saying, no, we're not pirates, we thought you were pirates. And they tried playing innocent, but it was very obvious from the victims they had caught that this was a crew of people who had had a crew of victims of piracy. So yeah, they had enough smoking guns to prove it was him, and enough dead provincial sailors as well. And Danny, I see your comment on Nicholson calling Pennsylvania a den of pirates. He also called Charleston that too. He called every colony of that.
I don't know if it's Dr. McNaughton that's as test, listed as test. I think she's saying, I'll talk about this and Siemens Vade Meekum in my talk. There's specific reasons why Blackbeard demanded a ransom of medical supplies. So that'll be really interesting.
I'm excited to see that one.
Yeah, that's going to be our last one. Yes. Yay. Hi, Dr. Linda. We're excited about your talk. I think probably, as a former guide myself, probably get more questions, in Charleston, particularly about Blackbeard than anything. And it is really interesting what you're talking about, Ben, as far as, here we have this walled city, which has in 1706 has kind of defended Charleston, especially, from a aesthetic point of view. The Spanish and the French aren't really attacking it because of the well defended harbor that it looks like. And then here comes Blackbeard, and he's blockading the harbor and causing all sorts of mischief. So he's creating probably more of a problem against the walled city than the combined French and Spanish armada that's coming, which is wild to think about. I guess in a way, though, he's not planning to take the city. He's just planning to be a pain until he kind of gets what he wants. So, but that really is. Jim said, last week's speaker said that Blackbeard might have been born in Goose Creek, not Bristol, England. What do you think, Ben?
So this is actually a hot topic. If you follow the very small community that are pirate historians, so a little bit of navel gazing when I bring this up. I have to say that first. Among pirate historians, it's actually a hot topic. That's a very convincing case. I'm not sure that I'm personally sold on that particular take, because there is a letter from 1718 where I think it's Nicholson or one of the colonial governors says, quote, "Teach has a wife in London." So also when Charles Johnson, for all his problems, writes the General History of Pirates, and there's a lot of problems with that source, he does get some stuff right, and there wasn't any pushback on that particular point when he says he's from Bristol. But I will be honest that I try to stay out of the "where is Blackbeard from" debate, because at the end of the day, I don't think that changes his story too much. And I'm just as happy to hear that, you know, if someone has evidence that he's from South Carolina as if he's from Bristol. Personally, I think he's from Bristol, but it is an ongoing debate, and it's a friendly debate. I mean, I have very close friends like Kevin Duffus, who I disagree with on this, but whose work I respect immensely. And so it's not like a "you're wrong" and blah, blah, blah. And it's just an interesting, kind of a fun debate about sources that I don't think anyone, including myself, has a definitive answer on. So I hope that answers your question.
Dr. McNaughton said she's got a good genealogy on Blackbeard as well. So we'll look forward to that as well. I think it's one of those things where Charleston has so many firsts and so many like areas of significance, and we can't get greedy and maybe take Blackbeard too. But we got plenty of other stuff.
We've got Darius Rucker, and we've got Bill Murray. We got famous people.
Ghost Creek is in Charleston. Ghost Creek is in Charleston. They can have their own.
Oh, true. Well, true.
Yeah.
True.
I mean, we do have pirates from here. I mean, Eric listed a fair number, and actually, I want to pick his brain because some of them tie into. For instance, Robert Seabrook is buried at my church, so I'm trying to get the rector to do a little pirate write up for the church. I just thought it'd be fun for the Sunday school. So I have some questions on local pirates outside of Blackbeard that I would like to learn more about.
That's great. Well, Goose Creek does have Colonel George Chicken, which is a great name. So so any other questions before we say goodbye for tonight? And again, do join us on Saturday for our Living History event. It's going to be so much fun. We've got the pirate flag flying all month. Just look for that on Cumberland Street and come by and see us. And then our next week's speaker is Karen Bloom, who's going to have a great talk for us about the women pirates. And then she's going to be doing living history with her husband. So it's going to be Mary Reed and Captain Jack Rackham at the Powder Magazine on the next Saturday, May 20th. So we're just being overrun by pirates. So anyway, we thank you so much for attending. And I think I've got everyone's name who needs tour guide credits, but if you didn't see yourself listed up at the top, please let me know. And again, you can just email info@powdermag.org if you came and you just want to make sure. So, but we'll see you Saturday or see you next Tuesday. So thanks again to Ben. Wonderful, wonderful lecture. I know I learned a lot.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see everybody next time. Thanks again.
Thank y'all.